So at this time, one of our great state leaders is with us. Help me give a great big Texas Panhandle welcome to Mr. Glenn Hegar.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Do you do road shows? Because I want you to go on the road show and introduce me always. So normally people, they get up and they read this bio and it's just boring and terrible, and that's good. I like that. We'll have to record that, but it's good to be with y'all. Yes, Ken, he did call me and asked me, said, hey, would you come up to my hometown of Canadian, Texas, and speak to some of the good folks in the district and the area up in the Panhandle? I said, absolutely. So glad to be up here. And you know what I didn't tell him at the time, I said absolutely quickly. Why? Because it's going to get me out of Austin today. So if any of y'all been to Austin, especially when they're in a legislative session for this long, they've got a little less than 5 weeks to go. And about this time of the year, I am so ready for them to go home. Back when I used to serve in the state legislature, as you'd heard, I served in the House and the Senate. And in my little old district was west of Houston. I grew up northwest out of Houston, a little community called Hockley. If you drive down Highway 290 and you blink, you missed it. I mean, that's how big it was. I mean, none of y'all would understand anything about a town like that up in the Panhandle, would you, whatsoever? And so if you drive down through Hockley, you blink, you miss it, you keep your eyes open, you'd see Hegar Road, and that was us. And so my district was a pretty good-sized rural district, and my folks were the type that when I was coming back home during a legislative session, the ladies, you would have held your purse a little bit closer than what you got on the floor, and gentlemen would hold their wallet or the billfold. And then when I get out of session, nobody felt uncomfortable. I mean, they just was all normal and casual. And I remember the first time I said, well, you know, last time I saw you seemed like uncomfortable because we were in legislative session. Now you seem so relaxed. And I said, well, what gives? And they said, well, hell, you can't do nothing to us now, so that's why we're relaxed. You know, and that's actually kind of the truth. I assume folks here are kind of like the folks that I used to represent. Not having the legislature in session would be a lot better. Now, I'm going to talk about a few different things today. One, just a quick background. I want you to just quickly kind of know what we do in the Comptroller's office in case you haven't. Just quick history. The Comptroller's office goes all the way back to days of Washington on the Brazos. So the first Comptroller of Public Accounts literally goes back to the individual who raised their hand or who drew the short straw back when they were trying to fight for Texas independence from Santa Anna, and the person that drew the short straw was Texas Comptroller of Public Accounts back then. And so what do? I'm the 36th that since that time, and of course now, back then it was really appointed who would draw the short straw, and today it's an elected position that's a 4-year term as one who serves in the executive branch. I've got roughly 2,800 plus employees, 25 divisions, but what do we mainly do? Number one, we run the finance treasury section. We were sitting over here talking about, what do you do? And I was making the joke. I said, well, I run a small accounting shop. And a lot of times people go, well, how small is that accounting shop? Well, in case you didn't realize, the glass in front of you, if that glass was your state budget, the top 1/3 is your federal dollars that we send to D.C., come back in some shape, form, or fashion, and the bottom 2/3 is your state dollars. And when you add all of those up, believe it or not, that literally ends up being $105 billion a year. And I did not stutter. I said billion. And so my office is the finance treasury section. We are essentially making sure that all of those dollars get paid to where they're supposed to be. And then number two, here's the danger of where I'm going to tell you a little background. Besides growing up on that family farm that's been there since 1848, on my line, my grandfather in my town that close where I grew up to and where I went to public education at, a little community called Waller, my grandfather was the Baptist preacher in town. And so the second thing I'm going to tell you of responsibilities is one that every time I say it, I think back to my grandfather, Lowell Thompson, and his sermons there in Little Waller Baptist Church, because I never forget the sermon sitting in the pew when he talked about the tax collector. Because if y'all recall your biblical history, they stoned the tax collector in the Bible. And you go, what does that have to do with what you do? My second job is I am the tax collector. So I always make sure that in the hat or anywhere ain't nobody got a bucket of rocks sitting around. And with this crowd, I figured y'all kind of like where I grew up. Nobody likes the tax collector. Well, he's standing in front of you today. So the second thing is we do the tax collection. And then thirdly, we're trying to monitor and look at what is the state economy across Texas. I'll give you a quick little history, and then I'll get off in a little bit about agriculture. If you look across the entire state of Texas, 254 counties, 12 economic regions. Back to 2014 when I got elected, amazingly, unfortunately, in Texas at that time, to fast forward to roughly about middle of last year, Texas lost quite a few jobs, principally in two industries. We lost 100,000 jobs in the oil industry. We lost 60,000 jobs in the manufacturing industry across the state. And of course, they weren't all distributed evenly across the state of Texas. They were more higher concentrated in some areas than others. But back in 2015, Texas was literally the 12th largest economy in the entire world. Think about that. Texas as a state was the 12th largest economy in the entire world as a state. You lose 100,000 jobs in one industry, 60,000 jobs in another industry, which has a ripple effect across the state of Texas. And Texas, unlike our neighboring states, whether it's Oklahoma just a few miles from here, or New Mexico, Louisiana, Oklahoma, again, whether you go to North Dakota, Alaska, Wyoming, where those states actually up until today, all of those states with the exception of New Mexico, all of those are still negative jobs. Where in fact, interestingly, Texas during that time period has actually 23 out of 24 months has actually gained jobs as a state. Pretty phenomenal. And if you think about in the region that we're in here today, it's pretty amazing to know that up in the Panhandle region of the state of Texas, as one of the 12 economic regions, this region of the state, if it was a state, and don't get any ideas, because I do not want you to become part of another state, but if it was another state, this 40-plus county region in the Panhandle, from a per capita income perspective, as in what's the average income of the citizens that live in this part of the state, that 41 county region in the upper Panhandle, in fact, interestingly, it would, as a state, would be the 34th ranked far as highest per capita income wise. Isn't that pretty amazing to think, up in the Panhandle of the state of Texas? And a lot of people don't have any idea about that. But if you go back, Texas again was the 12th largest economy, and then the question was last year, in looking at the economic data of the state of Texas as the hat that we wear from that vantage point in the comptroller's office, the question was, were we still going to be the 12th largest economy in the world? And in fact, we weren't. So the question you have to ask is, well, how far did we move down? In fact, we didn't move down, we moved up. And some people go, well, I heard you're an Aggie. Is it Aggie math that you use to get us from 12 to higher? I mean, that something doesn't make any sense. You know, sometimes people hear that the state of Texas, on average, in the last 20 years has grown roughly 3.8% growth every single year, which is way outpaced the U.S. average. And so, therefore, last year, we only grew by 0.4%, which was, at least we were positive, where the other states that were significantly pulled down from the oil and gas manufacturing, and then obviously, if you look at agriculture across the state, you know, the commodity prices have not quite what we have wanted them to be for quite some time, and that's wholesale, or really with all the commodity prices. But in fact, if you go back to last year, interestingly, Texas moved from the 12th to the 10th largest economy in the entire world. And you go, well, wait, how did we get there? Because if we barely grew as an economy, how did we move up instead of move down? Interestingly, Texas was already, as the 12th, we were already larger than the economy of Australia, larger than the economy of Spain, larger than the economy to our neighbor, Mexico. And normally when I'm giving a speech, I go right just south of us. Well, up in the Panhandle, that's a long ways to Mexico from here. So it's a little bit further from here. But in fact, Texas, who did we move over in the last year? I'll give you a hint. Further north of here, and it's real cold. Canada. And then the other one is also really cold. And we have heard about them in the news. If y'all have heard anything in the national news, they've been talked about almost every day nonstop for the last 6 months. And if you can't figure out who they are, it starts with an R. Russia. Now think about that. The Texas economy is bigger than the Russian economy. Really? And so every time, I don't know about you, but now you can join me. Every time I hear that in the national media, I think all them people are worried about Russia. They need to be worried about Texas. Because the Texas economy is a lot bigger than the Russian economy. I say a lot, it's all relative, you know, and it's pretty amazing to know And somebody who grew up in agriculture, I was giving a speech not too long ago, and somebody had asked me, it was actually one of the co-ops that we're a member of, and they are down in the Bryan College Station area, and we're a member of the co-op and have been members of that cooperative for years. And so they have a little program they do on Saturday on the local TV station. And so I was doing an interview with the board, just sitting. They were at the Capitol, so I went over to talk to them for a while. And at one point, the general manager, Mr. Deathridge, he had asked me, he said, Glenn, you've been around agriculture for a while. He said, tell me, what is the value of agriculture that has across the state of Texas? Well, number one, it's the economic impact that it provides. You know, and if you're up here in the High Plains, you're up here in the Panhandle area, this 41 county economic region out of the 12 economic regions, that is the driver of this economic region. And then to think again, and just to re-emphasize, to think about the fact that of the 50 states across the United States, the per capita income up in this area is higher than 16 other states is pretty phenomenal. You know, and growing up in agriculture, a lot of times folks, oh, well, you know, what does agriculture provide? Well, number one, did we just have a meal? Yes, we did. You know, and I kind of laughed as our performers were saying, is this lunch or is it dinner? And I don't know about you, but I chuckled because growing up on that family farm, this would pretty much have been an afternoon snack or a dinner because you get up pretty early in the day to make a lot of things happen, and everybody has a meal, and guess what? If it wasn't for agriculture, they wouldn't have that meal. You know, and I always laugh because kids, they talk about, you know, you always see those interviews, and you ask kids, say, well, where did the milk come from? Where did the steak come from? Where did those eggs come from? And they say the grocery store. Well, no, it didn't come from the grocery store. It came from your ranches. That's where it comes from, and it's that hard work ethic. When I ran for this office, I remember one of the debates we had, and you know, it's always good to be the last guy that goes sometimes. Sometimes it's good to be the first one to go. Well, that question, it happened to be I was the last person to go, and the question was what is the one thing that you need to have to be the Texas Controller of Public Accounts? Again, you handle all that money, got a big staff that you're overseeing, and everybody gave these big fancy answers, and I just stood up, and sometimes I adhere to the Forrest Gump model, and the Forrest Gump model is keep it simple, stupid. You know, just make it as simple as you can. And I stood up and I said, well, it's pretty much one word. It's called character. And then I sat down, and they all kind of looked at me, and the funny thing is the other three, throughout the rest of the debate, they used character more than any word I've ever heard in my life. And I thought, well, sometimes, you know, common sense of the country folks actually dominates and takes over. And my point being is, you know, the reason I was more than willing to be here again is you got me out of Austin today, and you got me back to the folks that I grew up around. And, you know, the fact is all across this nation and around the world, and you know this as well as anybody, this country and this state is extremely productive. As I mentioned, we have had a higher gross state productivity as a state in Texas more than the national average year after year practically for 20 years. Why is that? Well, number one, if you were in a third world country, guess what? You wouldn't be able to be productive because you're too worried about how do you feed your family every single day. Well, the fact is maintaining a very reliable, strong food source is actually critical, and that's one that we have to make sure of. I was visiting earlier today because when I was in the Senate, you know, my old Senate district, I had a third of the Texas coast. I had 5 major rivers that ran through my district, had a huge number of aquifers, and I'll never forget one of the times when I was a freshman in the Texas House of Representatives, we had a rough budget year that year. And I was on the Senate floor, House floor, and we were debating the budget, and people were wanting to take money out of brush control programs. And I was fighting to keep it in, even though in my district, we didn't really have brush control issues, but it was issues in other parts of the state, and I thought it was important. And as we were having the debate, I kept asking the person on the front mic, which was my freshman colleague, he was wanting to take money out of that and put it in somewhere else. And I just said, you know, Representative, I said, what is the one thing that you got to have to survive in life? And he mumbled for a while, and he didn't answer me. And I asked him again, and he mumbled a while. And then I said, what is the one thing that you have to have? What I was trying to get him to say was water. And the point being is taking water and moving it all to your suburban, urban areas does not allow you to have a reliable food source. You've got to have it throughout the rest of the state of Texas because that is the lifeblood of every society, is what I was trying to lure him into. And apparently I was not doing a too good job, because his answer, when finally, I think the third or fourth time I asked him the question, he looked up at me and I said, what is that one thing we all have to have? And he said, love. And I wanted to say that is not the right answer. Now, the funny thing, and even a couple of my staffers that are here, what they don't know is in my desk drawer, I have a bookmark, because he went back. He lived in the valley, and he went back to the valley that weekend, and I don't know, he was shopping with his kids somewhere or something, and he found a bookmark, and right across the bookmark it says love. And so he gave it to me, and I kept it in my desk drawer to remember I'm going to do a better job the next time when I try to ask somebody a question. But, you know, if you look at... it's pretty amazing. I was looking at some numbers. You know, the beef industry in Texas is at the height of those that produce here in the state for agriculture. Without the beef industry, agriculture would be significantly less in Texas. The agriculture industry in Texas is a significant contributor to this state economy. And the state economy, again, as I mentioned, is the 10th largest in the world, and that is a $1.6 trillion economy. And so not only when you get to wake up in the morning and you get to be out away from the city of Austin, which is where I'll be in the morning, and I'm going to be envious of you because you are not trapped in the middle of town, and one, you get to thank God that you're out in God's country, but number two, you get to wake up and say, you know what? We are one of the biggest contributors to agriculture and one of the biggest contributing industries in this state, but also across this entire nation. As you know, it's pretty phenomenal that Texas alone, over 30%, 36% of all the people that are having beef that day, they get to say thank you to Texas. Think about that. 36% across the entire nation. And now what all I need to do is, how can we figure out a way to make sure that there's a stamp on it that says Texas? Every time that somebody cuts into it, and somebody asks me, sometimes folks ask me and say, now, Glenn, you grew up on a family farm and a ranch. What's your favorite breed of cattle? Now, I'm going to let y'all in on a little secret. There's one favorite breed in the Hegar household, and it's called medium rare. That's my favorite breed, so if you ever invite me back, you don't have to ask. It's called medium rare. And my kids know, I got a 12-year-old daughter, a 9-year-old son, and a 9-year-old daughter, and any of them ever ask, they already know it's medium rare. And in our household, I always laugh if somebody ever comes over and I cook steaks and they go, do you have ketchup? And my kids say, nope, we don't. You got any kind of hot salt? Nope, we sure don't. You can put it on eggs, but you damn sure ain't putting it on a steak. So if you can't cook a steak and it tastes right, you ain't adding nothing to it. So anyway, I do not want to desecrate the hard work that you folks are putting out here by adding something to a steak. But, you know, I just, wanted to come up and say thank y'all for what you do. Thank you for what you contribute to the state economy. You know, my job, I was looking across because one of the hardest jobs as somebody that speaks is coming after people eat lunch. And I heard this from a lady not too long ago. She was giving a speech, and I loved what she said, because she said, you know, my job is to speak, and your job is to listen. Now, the question is, are we both going to end at the exact same time? Now, I can tell you, I've been looking across this crowd, and Andy, you did a good job with folks today, because I don't think there's a person that fell asleep today. So I want to say thank y'all for that. But one of the last things that I wanted to leave you with, and then I'll stop, and if you have time, I'm happy to answer a question or two if y'all have any questions. One thing that I wanted to mention is that, you know, somebody who grew up in that little family farm in Hockley, Texas, you know, it's there's been a lot of days to where I've gone out there, and it's a hard day. I was thinking about it not too long ago because I was out at the family farm, and we don't farm rice anymore. We principally farm corn is what my family farms today, and we do like it when you buy it. So if y'all want to buy some more, that'd be appreciative, because we want to drive up the prices there at the feedstock lot. But you know, growing out there, there's years to where it rains a bunch, and that's a pretty rough year. And then there's years to where it's pretty darn dry. And I'd swore to myself after the last drought that I would never, ever, ever complained about rain again. Well, we had those floods last year, and I got real close, but I didn't. But, you know, this area has been pretty hard. You've had droughts. You've had freezing cold blizzards in 2015, and then you had the wildfires this year. And one of the things that I wanted to make sure that you knew as the guy who's over the tax collection area, to make sure you are aware that obviously labor that goes into building residences is not taxable. But after an event like this, if you're repairing back that's not residential, the commercial side of it, is that as long as you separate out that labor on what you are paying, you don't pay sales tax on that. Now again, that's not going to make you whole, but it's one more way to help try to get people back to where they're at. And then also anything that is refurbishing what you have, whether it's in your residences, cleaning, you name it. And then I was thinking in the last one, it depends on where you're at up here. It may not apply to you too well because this is up on the high plains. I kind of chuckled because my staff also wrote a note to say, oh, remind everybody that by God, if you're doing cleanup of trees, the service on that, you don't have to pay tax on that. Well, I think y'all got that solved up here already. So there may not be a whole lot of trees for a lot of you. But anyway, that one applies too. But, you know, a lot of people do not know that those services and that labor is not taxable after a devastating event like that, and I think it's very critical that you know that. So I want to, again, say thank you for what you do for Texas. Thank you for the agriculture that you provide. I was talking to somebody earlier today, and I'll tell you a quick story, and then I'll open it up to questions. It was years ago, and it was about a month and a half ago, years ago, we were planting our corn. And back when I was still in the legislature, and I'd go home on the weekends, and I'd work all weekend and then work at night and try to help family plan. And a constituent of mine, she had called, and I'd known her for years, and she said, Glenn, my son David is back from Tech, and he'd like to do a story on somebody, a report. He's got to report on somebody that's elected. Could he come, visit with you today? And I know it's Saturday. And I said, no, that's fine. I'm at the office. She said, good, I'll send him over to Katie. And I said, no, that ain't the office I'm at. And she said, well, you in Austin? I said, no, ma'am, I'm back home. She said, well, what office are you in? And I said, I'm in my mobile office. And she said, well, what office is that? And I said, it's 8430. And she said, well, what is that? I said, it's called a John Deere. And she said, what? And I said, it's a tractor. I said, we're planting. My job is to pull the beds. I'm out here, and, he's happy to drive. Today we got this low seat on the side. He can fit in with me, and he can hang out with me. So anyway, he was out there for best part of the day. And he was very inquisitive. You turn around, and you hit that little button, and he's like, ooh, ain't you going to grab the steering wheel? I said, I don't have to grab the steering wheel. He goes, well, how are you going to drive? I said, it drives itself. So he was very entertained that you push a button, it's called GPS. And so I explained that to him. And then he got to ask me, he said, well, what's that thing you got behind the bedder? And I said, oh, that wagon back there. I said, we got potash in one and phosphate in the other. And it's, see this computer monitor. I said, this is an application. It's a prescription application that we're putting out on the farm, and we've already kind of got the whole land surveyed, so that way we don't put too much fertilizer out, because, in our business at the time, you're talking about a third of your cost could be in your fertilizer. And so we went on and on and on. Later that day, long story short, Cinda, my friend, called me. She said, I just want to say thank you for letting David come out. He really enjoyed it. He thought it was so great. And I said, well, I'm glad that he appreciated learning about what I do in the legislature and about my service to the state. And she said, oh, no, he didn't really care about that. He liked all that technology you got in that tractor. And so that's when I learned, it kind of made me laugh that sometimes if people would get out into the world that we live in, they'd find it pretty amazing, because that food, it doesn't just pop up in the grocery store. It's a lot of hard work, a lot of sweat and equity that goes into making that happen. And so again, I want to say thank y'all for what y'all do. Thank you for letting me be up here today.